The Ellie Nesler story. The confession letter arrived at the DA's office on a Tuesday morning. Handwritten and heartbreaking. My mother has been in prison for 15 years for a murder I committed. She saved me that night, and now it's time I saved her. It was signed Brandon Nesler, and it would reopen the most shocking case of maternal sacrifice in legal history. Welcome to Justice System USA, where we bring you the untold stories of America's legal system. Before we continue with Ellie's incredible story of a mother's love, sacrifice, and the son who finally found the courage to set her free, tell me in the comments what city are you watching from today. And if you believe stories of family loyalty and ultimate redemption deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. The night that changed everything. March 15, 2008, Phoenix, Arizona. The small duplex on Maple Street had seen better days, but for Ellie Nesler and her 16-year-old son Brandon, it was home. Ellie, 34, worked double shifts at a local diner to make ends meet after her divorce from Tommy Walsh. 2 years earlier, the divorce had been brutal, filled with accusations, threats, and court orders that Tommy routinely ignored. Tommy Walsh was a man who believed that marriage gave him ownership rather than partnership. During their 5-year marriage, he had controlled every aspect of Ellie's life: where she worked, who she spoke to, how she dressed, and especially how she raised Brandon, who wasn't his biological son. The physical abuse had started small, a shove here, a slap there, but escalated into something much darker. When Ellie finally found the courage to leave, taking Brandon with her, Tommy's rage had turned into obsession. Despite a restraining order, he would show up at her work, follow her home, and send threatening messages that grew more violent each week. The police had been called 17 times in 2 years, but Tommy was careful never to leave evidence. He knew the system, knew how to stay just within legal boundaries while making Ellie's life a living hell. Brandon had watched his mother shrink during those years with Tommy, watched her spirit break a little more each day. At 16, he was tall for his age and strong from working construction jobs after school to help with bills. He had his mother's dark eyes and gentle nature. But he also carried a quiet anger at the man who had terrorized the woman he loved most in the world. That evening started like so many others. Ellie had worked a double shift and come home exhausted, barely able to keep her eyes open as she heated up leftover soup for dinner. Brandon was at the kitchen table doing homework when they heard the familiar sound of Tommy's truck pulling into the driveway. "He's not supposed to be here," Brandon said, standing up from his chair. "The restraining order, I know," Ellie replied, her voice already shaking. "Go to your room. Lock the door." But Brandon didn't move. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of watching his mother live in fear of a man who had no right to terrorize them. "No, Mom, not anymore." The confrontation. Tommy didn't bother knocking. He used his key, the one Ellie had been too afraid to change locks for, knowing it would only make him angrier. He walked into their kitchen like he owned the place, reeking of alcohol and carrying the mean look that Ellie knew meant serious trouble. "Thought you could hide from me forever," Tommy said, his words slurred but his eyes sharp with malice. "Thought that piece of paper from the judge would keep me away." Ellie positioned herself between Tommy and Brandon, her heart racing but her voice steady. "You need to leave, Tommy. You're violating the restraining order. I'll call the police." Tommy laughed, a sound without humor. "Go ahead, call them. They'll be here in 20 minutes, and I'll be gone. But not before we settle some things." He moved closer to Ellie, and she could see the rage building in his eyes. This wasn't going to be like the other times when he'd just yelled and left. This was different. This was dangerous. "You think you can just take my family and disappear?" Tommy continued, his voice rising. "You think you can poison that boy against me and get away with it? I'm not your family," Brandon said from behind his mother, his young voice carrying more courage than he felt. "You never adopted me. You're nothing to me." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. His face darkened, and he took a step toward Brandon. "You little bastard. I spent 5 years putting food on your table, clothes on your back. You owe me respect." "I don't owe you anything," Brandon replied, moving to stand beside his mother. "Rather than behind her, all you ever gave us was fear." Tommy's control snapped completely. He lunged forward, grabbing Ellie by the shoulders and shaking her violently. "This is your fault. You turned him against me. You destroyed our family." Brandon had been preparing for this moment for 2 years, ever since the first time he'd seen Tommy hit his mother. He had grown 6 inches and gained 30 pounds of muscle, and he was no longer the scared little boy who had once cowered in his room while the adults fought. "Get your hands off her," Brandon shouted, grabbing Tommy's arm and pulling him away from Ellie. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and analyzed by experts for years to come. Tommy, drunk and enraged at being challenged by a teenager, swung a wild punch at Brandon's head. Brandon ducked, and Tommy's momentum carried him forward. Off balance. Brandon pushed back, trying to create space between Tommy and his mother. Tommy stumbled, caught himself against the kitchen counter, and grabbed a knife from the dish drainer. The blade was 8 inches long, meant for cutting roasts, but in Tommy's hands, it became a weapon of terror. "I'll kill you both," Tommy snarled, raising the knife. "If I can't have this family, nobody can." The fatal moment, time moved differently in that kitchen. Ellie saw the knife, saw the murder in Tommy's eyes, and knew that her worst fears were about to come true. She had spent 2 years trying to protect her son from this man. And now all her efforts had led to this moment where both their lives hung in the balance. Brandon saw the knife too, but he also saw something else, his mother's face, filled with terror not for herself but for him. In that split second, every protective instinct he had inherited from her kicked in. Tommy raised the knife high, preparing to bring it down on Brandon's neck. But Brandon was younger, stronger, and fighting for the only person in the world who mattered to him. He grabbed Tommy's wrist, trying to control the weapon, and the two males struggled violently across the small kitchen. They crashed into the refrigerator, knocked over chairs, and sent dishes flying from the counter. Ellie screamed, begging them to stop, but the fight had taken on a life of its own. Tommy was fighting to maintain dominance over a family he'd lost the right to control. Brandon was fighting for his life and his mother's safety. The struggle lasted less than a minute, but it felt like hours. Tommy was bigger, but the alcohol had slowed his reflexes. Brandon was scared, but fear gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. They grappled for control of the knife, spinning around the kitchen in a deadly dance. And then it was over. Tommy Walsh fell to the linoleum floor, the knife buried deep in his chest, his eyes wide with shock and quickly dimming with death. Brandon stood above him, breathing hard, blood on his hands and shirt from the struggle. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Ellie's sobbing and Brandon's ragged breathing. Mother and son stared at each other across the body of the man who had terrorized them for years. "Mom," Brandon whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean, I was just trying to stop him from hurting you." Ellie looked at her son, her beautiful, gentle boy who had just killed a man to protect her, and made a decision that would define the rest of both their lives. "The sacrifice. Go to your room," Ellie said quietly, her voice suddenly calm and determined. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you." "Mom, what are you, Brandon? Listen to me." Ellie's voice carried an authority he had never heard before. "Go to your room right now. Take off those clothes and put them in a garbage bag. Shower, put on clean clothes, and then wait." Brandon started to protest, but something in his mother's eyes stopped him. He had never seen her look so focused, so certain of what she was doing. "But Mom, I can explain what happened. It was self-defense. He had a knife." "No," Ellie said firmly. "You're 16 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. I won't let you throw it away because you protected me from a monster." Brandon finally understood what his mother was planning, and his heart broke. "No, Mom, please. I can't let you. You can, and you will," Ellie replied, already moving toward the kitchen sink to wash Tommy's blood from her hands. "This is my decision, my responsibility. Now go." Brandon hesitated for one more moment, looking at his mother with eyes full of love and anguish. Then he did as she asked, because even at 16, he understood that arguing would only make things harder for both of them. Alone in the kitchen with Tommy's body, Ellie spent the next hour preparing for the rest of her life. She cleaned up the obvious signs of a struggle, arranged Tommy's body in a position that suggested she had stabbed him during a direct confrontation, and practiced the story she would tell police. When she was ready, Ellie picked up the phone and dialed 911, double quotes 911. "What's your emergency?" "I killed my ex-husband," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He's in my kitchen. I stabbed him." "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No," Ellie replied. "I'm fine. He's dead. I killed him, and I'm not sorry." The investigation, Detective Ray Morrison had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the pattern immediately. Ex-husband with a history of abuse, restraining order violations, escalating threats, and finally, a confrontation that ended in death. When he arrived at the duplex on Maple Street, Ellie Nesler was sitting at her kitchen table, still covered in blood, waiting calmly for police to arrest her. "Mrs. Nesler," Detective Morrison said gently, "can you tell me what happened here tonight?" Ellie's story was simple and consistent. Tommy had come to the house drunk and angry, violating his restraining order. He had threatened to kill both her and Brandon. When he grabbed a knife from the counter, she had fought him for it and stabbed him in self-defense. "Where is your son now?" Morrison asked. "In his room, sleeping. He's been in there all evening, doing homework. He didn't see anything." Morrison interviewed Brandon separately, and the teenager's story matched his mother's perfectly. He had been in his room with headphones on, doing math homework. He heard some shouting but thought it was just another argument. He didn't come out until police arrived and his mother called for him. The physical evidence supported Ellie's version of events. Her fingerprints were on the knife. Tommy's blood was on her clothes and hands. There were signs of a struggle, but nothing that contradicted her claim of self-defense during a domestic violence incident. Brandon's behavior during questioning was what convinced Morrison that the boy was telling the truth. He seemed genuinely shocked by Tommy's death, confused by the events, and protective of his mother, in the way teenagers typically are when their parents are in trouble. He was a bad man, Brandon told Morrison during his interview. He hurt my mom for years. But I never thought it would end like this. What Morrison didn't see was the guilt eating away at Brandon from the inside, the knowledge that his mother was taking responsibility for his actions. What he didn't hear was the conversation between mother and son later that night, where Ellie made Brandon promise to never tell anyone the truth. If you ever say what really happened, Ellie told her son, it won't bring me home. It will just destroy your life too. Promise me you'll keep this secret, Brandon, sobbing in his mother's arm, promised. The trial. The state of Arizona charged Ellie Nesler with second-degree murder. The prosecutor, District Attorney Catherine Walsh, acknowledged the domestic violence history but argued that Ellie had used excessive force in a situation where she could have called for help instead of confronting Tommy with deadly violence. This wasn't self-defense, Walsh told the jury during opening statements. This was revenge. Mrs. Nesler had suffered years of abuse, and when Tommy Walsh came to her home that night, she saw an opportunity to end her torment permanently. Ellie's defense attorney, James Rodriguez, painted a different picture. He showed the jury photographs of Ellie's injuries from previous domestic violence incidents, played recordings of threatening voicemails Tommy had left, and presented testimony from neighbors who had witnessed his harassment. Ellie Nesler is not a murderer, Rodriguez argued. She's a survivor. When Tommy Walsh came to her home that night with a knife, threatening to kill her and her son, she did what any mother would do. She fought for her life and her child's life. The evidence supported both narratives. Tommy Walsh had indeed been an abusive ex-husband with a history of violating restraining orders. The kitchen showed signs of a violent struggle. Ellie's injuries were consistent with defending herself against an armed attacker, but there were also troubling elements that favored the prosecution. Tommy's blood alcohol level suggested he had been severely intoxicated, possibly too impaired to pose the level of threat, Ellie claimed. The angle of the knife wound suggested a deliberate thrust rather than a defensive reaction. Most damaging was Ellie's demeanor. While some domestic violence survivors might seem calm after killing their abuser, Ellie appeared almost resigned to her fate. She showed little emotion during testimony about Tommy's abuse, answered questions in a monotone voice, and seemed disconnected from her own defense. Brandon testified on his mother's behalf, describing years of living in fear of Tommy Walsh. His testimony was heartbreaking and convincing a teenager who had watched his mother suffer and was now trying to save her from a murder conviction. She never wanted to hurt anybody, Brandon told the jury, tears streaming down his face. Tommy made our lives hell for years. All she ever wanted was for us to be safe. What the jury didn't know was that Brandon's tears weren't just grief for his mother's situation. They were guilt over his own cowardice in letting her sacrifice herself for his actions. The verdict and sentencing. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Ellie Nesler guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The verdict was a compromise, not the murder conviction the prosecution sought, but not the complete exoneration the defense had hoped for. Judge William Hayes sentenced Ellie to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. In his sentencing statement, he acknowledged the tragic circumstances that had led to Tommy Walsh's death while emphasizing that the law couldn't excuse taking another person's life. Mrs. Nesler, Judge Hayes said, the court recognizes that you suffered significant abuse at the hands of Mr. Walsh. However, the law provides legal remedies for domestic violence that don't involve deadly force. Your decision to take justice into your own hands, while understandable, cannot go unpunished. Ellie listened to her sentence without emotion, but Brandon collapsed in the courtroom gallery. At 17, he was watching his mother be taken away for a crime he had committed, and the weight of his secret was crushing him. As bailiffs led Ellie away in handcuffs, she looked back at her son one final time. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and she mouthed the words, "I love you," before disappearing through the door that would separate them for the next 15 years. Life behind bars. The Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville became Ellie's new home. She was assigned to a medium security unit with other women convicted of violent crimes, most of whom had their own stories of abuse, desperation, and impossible choices. Prison life was harsh but predictable. Ellie worked in the laundry facility, attended mandatory counseling sessions for domestic violence survivors, and slowly built a reputation as someone who kept to herself but could be trusted. Other inmates respected her quiet dignity and the fact that she never complained about her situation or claimed innocence. What they didn't know was that Ellie spent every night lying awake, wondering if she had made the right choice. She had saved her son from a murder conviction, but at what cost? Brandon was growing up without his mother, carrying a secret that was poisoning his soul, and struggling with guilt that no teenager should have to bear. Brandon visited every weekend, for the first 2 years, making the 4-hour drive from Phoenix to Perryville every Saturday morning. But as he got older, the visits became more painful for both of them. He was attending college on a partial scholarship, working part-time to pay for expenses, and trying to build a life while carrying the weight of his mother's sacrifice. You need to stop visiting, Ellie told him during one particularly difficult conversation. You need to move on with your life. I can't just forget about you, Brandon replied, his voice breaking. This is my fault. All of it. No, Ellie said firmly. This was my choice. My decision. You were a child protecting his mother. I was an adult who chose how to handle the consequences. But Brandon couldn't accept his mother's reasoning. As the years passed, his guilt transformed into a mission. He finished college with a degree in criminal justice, went to law school, and became a defense attorney specializing in domestic violence cases. Every client he helped was a small step toward the redemption he hoped would eventually free his mother. The weight of truth. By 2018, Brandon Nesler was 26 years old and a successful attorney with his own practice in Phoenix. He had handled dozens of domestic violence cases, helped numerous families escape abusive situations, and built a reputation as someone who genuinely cared about his clients. But professional success couldn't ease the guilt that consumed him every day. He had spent 10 years watching his mother waste away in prison for his crime, and the weight of that knowledge was destroying his ability to enjoy any part of his life. Brandon's personal relationships suffered because he couldn't share his deepest truth with anyone. He had tried dating, but how do you explain to someone that your mother is in prison for a murder you committed? He had considered therapy, but how do you tell a counselor about a secret that could send you to prison and hurt the person you love most? The breaking point came on his 30th birthday, when Ellie called him from prison to wish him well. She sounded older, more tired, and for the first time in 15 years, truly defeated. I'm proud of you, she told him. You've built a good life. Your father would be proud too. Brandon's biological father had died in a car accident when he was 2, and Ellie rarely mentioned him, but hearing her reference the father he'd never known, while sitting in prison for protecting him from an abusive stepfather, finally broke something inside Brandon that had been cracking for years. Mom, he said, his voice shaking, I can't do this anymore. Can't do what? I can't keep letting you pay for what I did. It's been 15 years. 15 years of watching you suffer for my actions. I'm going to tell the truth. Brandon, no, we've been through this. You'll destroy your career, your life. What life? Brandon interrupted. I haven't had a life. For 15 years, I've had guilt and shame and the knowledge that the best person I know is rotting in prison because I was too cowardly to take responsibility for my own actions. Ellie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than he'd heard it since that night in the kitchen. Baby, I made my choice because I love you. If you confess now, it won't bring me home any faster. It will just ruin everything I sacrificed for. Maybe, Brandon replied, but I'd rather be in prison with a clear conscience than free with this guilt. I can't carry it anymore. Mom, I'm sorry. The confession. Brandon spent 3 weeks crafting his confession letter, writing and rewriting the words that would finally tell the truth. About March 15, 2008, he consulted with other attorneys about the legal implications, understanding that he was almost certainly confessing to a crime for which the statute of limitations had not expired. The letter he finally delivered to District Attorney Catherine Walsh's office was 4 pages long and devastatingly detailed. It described exactly how the fight with Tommy Walsh had unfolded, how his mother had coached him to hide the evidence, and how she had confessed to a crime she didn't commit to protect his future. I was 16 years old and terrified, Brandon wrote. My mother saw a scared boy who had killed someone in defense of his family, and she chose to sacrifice her freedom rather than see me spend my life in prison. I have spent 15 years trying to live up to that sacrifice, but I can no longer let an innocent woman pay for my actions. The letter included details that only someone present during the crime could have known: the exact sequence of events, the position of Tommy's body when he fell, and the specific injuries Brandon had sustained during the struggle that had never been documented because Ellie had hidden them. Most convincingly, Brandon offered to take a polygraph test and submit to any investigation the DA's office wanted to conduct. He provided the names of witnesses who could testify to his emotional state in the weeks following Tommy's death, and he offered to surrender himself immediately if the DA decided to press charges. The investigation reopened. District Attorney Catherine Walsh, now 15 years older and wiser than when she had prosecuted Ellie Nesler, read Brandon's confession with a mixture of shock and admiration. The case had always bothered her. Something about Ellie's demeanor during the trial had seemed off, but she had attributed it to trauma rather than deception. The confession explained everything that had puzzled investigators and prosecutors 15 years earlier: why Ellie had seemed so resigned to her fate, why her story, while consistent, had lacked the emotional intensity of a true victim recounting a traumatic event, why Brandon had seemed genuinely shocked by the events, despite living in the same house where they occurred. Walsh assigned a team of investigators to verify Brandon's claims, and what they found was a story of maternal love, so profound it had sustained a massive deception for a decade and a half. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up during the original investigation now came forward with accounts of seeing Brandon throw bloody clothes into a dumpster the morning after Tommy's death. A former classmate recalled Brandon confiding his guilt during a moment of weakness years earlier. Most damning was the physical evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene. When investigators compared Brandon's adult fingerprints to partial prints found on the kitchen counter that night, they found matches that had been missed during the original investigation, because no one had thought to fingerprint the victim's teenage stepson. The case was complicated by the passage of time, and the fact that Brandon's confession could be seen as an attempt to free his mother rather than a genuine admission of guilt. But Walsh was convinced that he was telling the truth, and more importantly, that justice required acknowledging the sacrifice Ellie Nesler had made. Justice delayed, justice served. On December 3, 2023, exactly 15 years after Ellie Nesler was sentenced for voluntary manslaughter, District Attorney Catherine Walsh stood before reporters and announced that new evidence had come to light that warranted a complete review of the case. After an extensive investigation prompted by new information, Walsh said, "My office has concluded that Mrs. Ellie Nesler was wrongfully convicted of causing the death of Tommy Walsh. Evidence suggests that Mrs. Nesler confessed to a crime she did not commit in order to protect her son, who acted in defense of his mother during a domestic violence incident." The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community and the families involved in the case. Brandon Nesler, standing beside Walsh during the press conference, publicly acknowledged his role in Tommy Walsh's death for the first time. 15 years ago, my mother made an impossible choice, Brandon said, his voice steady despite his tears. She chose my future over her freedom, and she has paid a price no mother should have to pay. Today, I'm making a choice to finally tell the truth and accept responsibility for my actions. The legal proceedings that followed were swift but complex. Brandon was charged with voluntary manslaughter, the same crime his mother had been convicted of, but under juvenile sentencing guidelines that reflected his age at the time of the offense. Meanwhile, Ellie's conviction was overturned, and she was granted immediate release pending a review of whether any charges would be filed related to her false confession. Judge William Hayes, now retired but recalled to handle the exceptional circumstances of the case, sentenced Brandon to time served and 5 years of probation, acknowledging that he had already been punished by 15 years of guilt and had demonstrated genuine remorse through his subsequent life choices. This case represents one of the most extraordinary examples of maternal sacrifice I have encountered in 30 years on the bench, Judge Hayes said during sentencing. While the court cannot condone taking the law into one's own hands, the circumstances of this case, a teenager protecting his mother from an armed and violent abuser, warrant compassion rather than punishment. Reunion and redemption. On December 15, 2023, Ellie Nesler walked out of the Arizona State Prison complex at Burryville, a free woman. Her son Brandon was waiting for her at the gates, along with dozens of supporters who had rallied around their story of love, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption. The reunion between mother and son was emotional and healing for both of them. Ellie, now 49, had spent 15 years believing that her sacrifice had been worthwhile because it had allowed Brandon to build a successful life. Brandon, now 31, had spent those same years believing that his mother's sacrifice had been wasted because he hadn't been able to enjoy the life she had given him. "I thought I was protecting you," Ellie said through tears as she embraced her son for the first time as a free woman in 15 years. "You did protect me," Brandon replied. "You protected me from becoming someone who could live with himself after letting his mother pay for his mistakes. It just took me 15 years to understand that." The story of Ellie and Brandon Nesler, it became a powerful example of how love can survive the most impossible circumstances, and how redemption is possible even when it seems too late. Ellie found work as a counselor for domestic violence survivors, using her experience to help other women navigate the complex emotions and difficult choices that come with abusive relationships. Brandon continued his legal practice, but expanded it to include wrongful conviction cases, inspired by his mother's experience and his own understanding of how the justice system can fail, even when people are trying to do the right thing. The legacy of love. Today, Ellie and Brandon Nesler live quietly in Phoenix, rebuilding a relationship that was sustained by love but tested by circumstances no family should have to endure. Their story has been studied by legal scholars as an example of how domestic violence can lead to tragic outcomes even when victims are trying to protect themselves and their families. But more than a case study, their story is a testament to the power of maternal love and the courage it takes to accept responsibility for one's actions, even when that responsibility comes 15 years too late. Ellie never regretted her decision to confess to a crime she didn't commit. "I would do it again," she says when asked about her choice. "I saw my 16-year-old son standing over a dead body, and I knew that he needed protecting. That's what mothers do." Brandon struggles with guilt about the years his mother lost, but he has channeled that guilt into a mission to help other families facing impossible choices. My mother taught me that love sometimes requires sacrifice, he says, but she also taught me that the truth, no matter how painful, is the only foundation for real redemption. The case led to changes in how domestic violence cases are investigated and prosecuted in Arizona, with new protocols for recognizing when family members might be covering for each other and better support systems for families dealing with the aftermath of domestic violence. What would you have done in Ellie's position that night? When faced with choosing between your child's future and your own freedom, when love demands the ultimate sacrifice, how do you decide? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what city you're watching from today. If this story moved you, subscribe to Justice System USA. We're committed to sharing the complex, deeply human stories of love, sacrifice, and redemption within America's legal system. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Stories that remind us that justice isn't just about laws and punishment, but about love, family, and the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in quiet kitchens, in split-second decisions, and in the willingness of people to sacrifice everything for those they love. Ellie Nesler proved that a mother's love knows no bounds, and Brandon Nesler proved that it's never too late to honor that love with the truth.